I know you are. Okay, so here's some things we need to talk about. Due dates. Let's talk about due dates. You may or may not have noticed, and I may or may not have done this in a timely fashion, but I changed the due dates for the weekly questions again because of snowpocalypse. We had that week off. So, sorry. Let me turn the phone over so I don't see what's showing up on my phone. Erin, did you want to ask a question? I don't know, I saw a little hand there. But I moved the due dates, the stuff. No, okay, maybe I made the hand go up. I have no idea. So I changed the due dates of the one that was originally due this Friday. No, it's probably me. To next Friday, which means right now, if you look at the assignments page, you have one thing due this Friday and two things due next Friday. Now, and we need to talk about the quiz as well. It's my feeling, which you don't have to agree with, but I'm probably right, but it doesn't mean you have to agree with. I think we probably should keep the quiz to next Friday. Yeah, I see my face. I think we should probably keep the quiz until next Friday. Because I don't think that having a week off for spring break is going to make you more likely to either remember or work on the stuff for the quiz. I could be wrong. I'm probably not, but that was my thought about the quiz. And thing number 2 that we've got to talk about is due dates on the weekly questions. Right now we have one due this Friday, 2 due next Friday. We could move a due date for one of the last weekly question until when you come back from spring break, or we could leave it as is. And then if you individually think I need a little more time, you could email me, and I'm not going to give you a hard time about it because, clearly I need a little more time to grade. So I'm probably going to be pretty flexible about when you turn the stuff in. But my goal, what my concern is overall, is that you're caught up with everything by the end of spring break, so that you have all the weekly questions done by the end of spring break. I know that for most of you, you're not going to take spring break and go like, hey, I think I want to do a whole lot of work. For a couple of you, that's going to be the time where actually you have set aside some time, you're not having to go to classes, and you're thinking this will be my chance to catch up. But my concern is if we push the time to catch up beyond spring break, you're never going to catch up. That's my concern. All right, so do we have any thoughts or objections to keeping the quiz next Friday? Do you have any thoughts or concerns about this? Do you think I'm right? Do you think I'm wrong? Do you even care? I know you care. I don't mean that in a bad way, but
Can you make it easier?
I don't know. I don't know if it's easier or not. Okay, I don't know. You mean by the 3 assignments, the quiz and the 2, because somebody said 3 assignments in 1 week, the quiz and the 2 weekly questions. Yeah. Okay. So and we'll talk about the weekly questions here in a sec, and that may help with that thought. Let me open the whole chat so I can see. Okay. All right. So hang on to your thought, Elijah. Hang on for 1 sec. Okay. So on the weekly questions, see, my thought about the quiz is you're not going to study over the break. I could be wrong, but I'm probably right. And I've taught for 30 years and I'm probably right. Now, to be honest, I was one of those students who probably would study over spring break because I worked while I went to college. So sometimes, I needed the little sleeping break. And then when I woke up, it's like, yeah, I can study now. All right, but if you are in that spot and you turn in, I think it would be easier to turn in a weekly question later because you're only focusing on one thing than studying for the whole quiz over spring break. That's what I was thinking. So if you're in that situation, Elijah, where you need the spring break to catch up on the weekly questions, if you do that, I'm cool with that. Understood. I got that. But what I'm trying to ask and not doing very successfully is, if we're postponing an assignment, would you prefer that it's the quiz or the weekly questions? Because I just really think postponing the quiz would be harder than postponing a weekly question. Yeah, see, that's what I was thinking, Elijah, that might be easier. And the reason I think that the quiz would be harder than the weekly question after spring break is because we're just going to have finished all the lectures about the weekly questions. And I just don't, or excuse me, about the content of the chapters. And I just don't really think you're going to want to study the entire chapter over spring break, but you might not mind looking at one thing to a question. I don't know if that makes any sense. All right, so we'll make all the decisions at once, but that's a nice discussion. Anything else you want to say about weekly, about quiz? Because it seems like majority is okay with the quiz next Friday. So that's probably what we'll do. And if you individually have a problem with that, you can let me know individually by email. We're talking, oh, why did you ask that? Let me look. Sorry, I know why you asked that. I'm not trying to give you a hard time. Weekly questions in Unit 2. Sorry for yawning at you. Unit 2 is 18, 19, 20, 21, I think. 18, 19, 20, 21. And we've talked we've already talked about 18. Most of you have turned that in. 19, that's the one due tomorrow, and you're probably ready on that. And we're talking about causes of the Great Depression today, and we'll definitely talk about New Deal stuff next Tuesday. Okay. So 18, 19, 20, 21. Open the chat back up if I can. All right. So, and what I'm thinking, okay, so probably quiz next Friday. If you individually have an issue, feel free to email me. As far as the weekly questions, what the other class did, and again, you don't have to do this, is we left the due dates for the weekly questions for 20 and 21 next Friday. However, if you don't get to one or both of them, just turn them in whenever, and I'm not going to penalize you for it. I don't want you turning in all 4 after spring break, but if you can at least get the first 2 done. But we could officially move the due date, because I know some of you already, I can tell, it bothers you to see a due date that you know you're not going to meet. We can move the due date, if that bothers you just to look at it that way, to like the Tuesday after, Monday or Tuesday after spring break, so that way you don't feel bad when you see that it looks late. I'm not going to take points off, but I can move the date, but the rest of you who know you're going to get it done, just turn it in when it's done. What do you want to do about the weekly questions? You want to leave the dates? Do you want me to change the due date for 21 to like that Monday after you return from spring break? Do you have any thoughts about this? And I'm promising you up front that if you turn in 21 late, yeah, I don't care. But I know it bothers some of you just to see the due date. So I don't want to cause you that little stress. Some of you got the OCD, and I don't want to make it worse. All right. Does anybody object strongly if I change the 21 due date to, let me look on my phone since I don't know what day anything is. Oh my goodness. Sorry. It's like 5 more texts from soccer coaches. They're more stressed than you, which is making me stressed. If I change that to the 21st of March, 22nd. And then if you individually have issues with that, is that okay if I do that? Does anybody object strongly? And the rest of you, if you got it done, just turn it in, because I definitely am going to catch up on grading over spring break. But if you turn in stuff on the 22nd, I don't care. So, all right. So we'll leave the quiz for Friday, not this Friday, next Friday. Oh my gosh, a revised syllabus. Maybe, yeah, because Yeah, maybe, or at least send out a paper that says what the revised due dates are. I'm also changing them on the assignments page. Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'm going to change, unless there's like really strong objection, I'll change the chapter 21 question to a March 22 official due date. You could, of course, turn it in before. Okay. All right. And the quiz needs to be done by next Friday. And it'll be just like the last one, where it'll open on Wednesday at midnight or 12:01 or something like that. And then the official due date is Friday at midnight. And if you need an extension beyond that, just let me know. Okay. Now, I don't want a week extension, but just if you need an extension, send me an email that explains. All right. Can we all live with all that stuff? Maybe. Yeah. Okay. All right. All right. Okay. That didn't seem, I felt like I was telling you what to do there, but maybe it's college professor hazard there. All right. So you should have already hopefully done the new nationalism, new freedom question. I know I'm behind on grading. My thought is probably, as much as I want to grade tomorrow, I don't think it's going to happen. Sunday for sure, and Monday. So hopefully by the next time I see you, everything that you have turned in will be grading. That's the goal. It almost has to happen that way. And then women, African American and Hispanic Americans in World War I. We'll talk about that a bit today. And then causes of the Great Depression, what might have prevented it. We'll at least talk about causes today. Okay. All right, good. I'm glad that you guys liked some of the weekly questions. You know, the goal really is, it'd be cool if you liked it. I know history's not everybody's thing, but it's also not bad if you learn some stuff too. That's of course the main goal. I know you. All right. Sorry for maybe a longer discussion than, or not as maybe well managed discussion on my end, but let's go. Let's go. Let's see. All right. So, all right. Making the world safe for democracy. There we go. So, World War I. All right. Let me grab the textbook. I know you got yours handy as well. Probably. Do you? Maybe you guys use the online book, probably. I don't know. I had a class where I used the online books, or I had actually a whole degree where I did that. And it worked out okay-ish, but I'm old. So it's harder for us when we're old. When you talk about the expansion of freedoms, changes of freedoms, for your weekly question, you've got some pretty good stuff, I think, in your textbook to help you out with that. I would look starting on page 749, because it starts talking about the cause of freedom, the idea of democracy, making the world safe for democracy. If you're going to make the world safe for democracy, you should probably make the United States safe for democracy. And then, maybe the whole world will be great, like the United States, where there'll be a nice, safe workplace and an 8-hour workday. And maybe women would get the right to vote. Certainly World War I, women's participation in World War I is that final push over the line to make sure that women get the right to vote. It does mention, no, you could read a book about this woman. It might be interesting as well. Jeanette Rankin, who is congresswoman or congressperson, congressman, I don't know, she's in Congress, from Montana, because a lot of the Western states let women vote because they helped found the West. So once you're out there, you can't say like, hey, we appreciate all the manual labor and stuff, but you can't vote anymore. The state of Montana elected Jeanette Rankin to represent them for probably half a decade. And she voted against U.S. entry into World War I. She also voted against U.S. entry into World War II. She was consistent. And in her 80s, she's out protesting the Vietnam War. So that tells you probably she's a pretty devoted pacifist there. The book mentions that women took part in the war effort by selling bonds, organizing rallies, working in war production jobs, served in Europe as clerical workers, nurses, support staff, that sort of stuff. And their thought was, if because we're doing this, when we come home, we're going to be treated equally. Certainly, there was a women's rights movement in England at the same time where women gained the right to vote, and the same will happen in the United States. This really is kind of that push over the edge. Wilson, that would be Woodrow Wilson, the president, had initially opposed women's right to vote, but the war is a pretty big reason that he changes his mind, and perhaps his wife is the second reason. His first wife that died, he remarries pretty quickly. The second wife was a little more assertive than the first wife. That would be a huge understatement if you know very much about Wilson, which I assume you don't, because that would be weird for teenagers. Like, yeah, I'm an expert on Woodrow Wilson's personal life. That would be strange. But his first wife was a little more old school for the time period, and much more submissive. The husband's in charge, and the second one he met in Washington was a little younger, certainly more assertive, and she's like, nope, women should vote. All right, so women gain the right to vote, and in part too, I don't know if you've read or seen that there's a movie too called Iron Jawed Angels Like Jaw. These women protested for the right to vote. They got arrested, and then they went on hunger strike, and they made sure that reporters were able to cover their hunger strikes. Because the reporters covered their hunger strikes, it kind of looked bad. The women were starving themselves to death so they could get the right to vote. So then the prison started force feeding them, and they did that by shoving a tube down their throat and putting some sort of fluid down there. And the women, of course, wanted to resist that, so they brought in this contraption. If you've ever had maybe some kind of intense dental surgery, you may have had something like this, where they open your mouth really, really wide, and it ends up tearing the edges of your mouth and scraping your jaw, that kind of stuff. But it's like a kind of like a vice. They don't do that anymore. But they did that to open the women's mouths so they could shove the tube down. And of course, it caused all sorts of pain and physical damage, that sort of stuff. It was one of those things that looked so bad that they stopped doing it. So um, the women's rights movement would argue, we wanted to be part of the war effort, that we're expanding freedom throughout the world, so we should get more freedom in the United States. So probably the biggest victory for groups at home was women getting the right to vote. That was probably let me see. I don't remember if there was anything more specific. Oh yeah. What was I thinking? So when you turn over to page 756 and 757, one of the things that doesn't work out very well is for the different ethnic and racial groups. After World War I, the science of eugenics becomes really trendy. The idea that certain people are more racially pure and superior becomes almost a science, and people study it. One of the universities that I attended back in a long time ago, Northeast Missouri State, which is now Truman State, they would be completely not happy that I shared that information. One of the leading eugenicists studied and wrote from that university, talking about how the study of genetics shows that people who are white are scientifically superior to other people. And by the end of the decade, there's no legitimate scientist in the United States that's going to agree with this. However, it doesn't mean that there's not already a ton of stuff written. They had like a Beautiful Babies contest where they talked about people's ethnic backgrounds. They had all sorts of weird contests and things about this. Lots of things produced during this time period that encouraged women to breed properly. It talks about the American Breeders Association to make sure women understood their job for posterity was to make sure not to have children with inferior men, and to make sure only to breed with people of superior genetic quality. There were certain instances where certain racial or ethnic groups were encouraged to be sterilized for the protection of the future population of the United States. So people who were in institutions, mental health institutions or prison institutions, may have been involuntarily sterilized. They mentioned the case of Buck versus Bell in 1927, which goes to the Supreme Court and upholds the idea of involuntary sterilization. We definitely change our minds about this. I think we talked before about Margaret Sanger, about how she wrote about, and she writes quite a bit in the 20s, changes her mind later, but you know, once you write it down, she talks quite a bit about how certain groups should not be allowed to reproduce because it's harmful to society. And honestly, almost everybody I know is in one of those groups. I know that I certainly am. So, you know, this was science for the time period, and it was it's not the best period in our history. I think we say that a lot, but it's not the best period in academic history at all. So, yeah, you could read about some stuff like this that would make you feel pretty terrible. The book mentions 63,000 people are involuntarily sterilized between this time period and for a very long time. Even though in the United States, by the end of the 20s, we reject this as science and we say that it's ridiculous, that sort of thing. There are groups of people throughout the world who will embrace this study and say that, you know, we had abandoned it and not carried it to its full potential. Many of those folks seem to reside in Germany during this time period. So, not so great. And then it also mentions toward the end of the chapter that people of Hispanic descent who may have immigrated during that time period or been encouraged to come into the country during that time period. Yes, that would be Nazis. I'm sorry I didn't say that out loud, but you were correct about that. Yeah, so I'm not blaming us for Nazis. They were, you know, well on their way without us, but certainly U.S. scholarship which we renounce, they embrace and carry to a horrific level. Yes, okay. You will notice that lots of different Hispanic groups will enter the United States during the war effort, so population grows during this time period, but the rights of Hispanic people in different regions are different. Yeah, and there's an odd discussion, maybe it's not an odd discussion, but there's a discussion of an odd thing in this chapter about how in many instances, people of Hispanic descent, especially Mexican Americans who emigrate during this era, are classified as white. And that's for a couple of reasons. I mean, in one instance, or in some instances, it's to allow them to gain citizenship and potentially the right to vote because they're classified as white and they wouldn't be discriminated against as much. In other instances, it's to continue to allow a different sort of segregation, because if you have a school that's separately for Mexican American kids, but they're classified as white, it's not technically a Mexican American school. So this is a very strange phenomenon. I know, like my husband, I'm sure that I mentioned him before, was a Mexican American fellow. He passed away. He didn't, you know, change. I don't know. He did not claim being Mexican American. And his family were migrant farmers in West Texas. And his birth certificate does say that he is white. And that was a source of some frustration to them. And I would tell them, like, hey, it's not so bad. But then they would tell me, like, shut up, stop giving us a hard time. So I was just teasing with them, which I shouldn't have done. And I probably shouldn't have told you. But it is a really strange historical phenomenon that in some instances was helpful, might get you treatment in hospitals and things like that, but in most instances was not helpful, and it was not always the intention to be helpful. And of course, There'll definitely have to be movements for people of almost any ethnic or racial group in an area where there are large numbers to push to integrate schools during that time period. There's a movement to integrate Asians into white schools during this time period. And there's a movement you don't see the movement carry on after the really brief post-World War I era for Hispanic integration into schools. You see that in a bigger way after World War II. So we'll talk about that later. And as far as African Americans, we've mentioned 100 times, for whatever reason, a variety of reasons, the progressive era reforms tend to leave African Americans out, even though there is large participation by African Americans in the World War I effort. And there's a pretty long discussion in your book of the NAACP, the continuation of lynching and other racial issues, and then of course the Great Migration, where it mentions percentage of increases of African American population in certain cities. The biggest ones being New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland. So they tend to be, eastern part of the country, places where you probably could get jobs during that time period. They also mentioned the Tulsa Riots during this time period. There's a very affluent area in Tulsa that ends up getting bombed because of reports of a black man who was an elevator operator, or a black man in an elevator falling on a white female elevator operator. And that was exaggerated or made up, but it led to an excuse to destroy a prosperous area of Tulsa. And by destroy, I mean burn down and bomb. They went to a crazy extreme. The book also talks about Marcus Garvey again, and some discussion of, I already mentioned the NAACP. So you may want to look over, you definitely want to look over that discussion as you answer the question about how does World War I change things for the different groups that were mentioned. Let me stop and I'll bring up the question again, and then we'll go back to finish the stuff. Oh dear, that was not what I wanted to do. Apparently that's what I'm going to do. One more try, so sorry. Wrong weekly questions. I'm sorry, this lack of sleep thing, it's not good, is it? All right. So, explain the reasons for and describe U.S. participation in World War I. And we talked about this last time. You have to mention the Zimmerman telegram. If you don't mention it, I will be sad, and you will be sad as well, because your grade won't be what you want it to be. All right. So Zimmerman telegram, you can talk about other stuff as well, but we've been supporting a certain side in World War I more than the other. Germans were sinking some of our ships. Then in the Zimmerman telegram, Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico. That was intercepted by the British and then published. So then we were kind of pushed into participation. Even though Wilson had already been preparing, you're aware of this, I am certain. Selective service and building up of the military, that sort of stuff. And how does it change the roles of women, African Americans, Hispanic Americans? There's certainly more jobs available. We've got that Great Migration that we just discussed. So you have African Americans moving from the South to larger cities in the North, women participating in the jobs. I had mentioned last time not to overstate this because it happens for about 2 years, not the rest of their lives for women. African Americans do remain in the northern cities, and you'll start to see some growth of the NAACP, I think in part because of that, because the headquarters are in New York. And for Hispanic Americans, also more participation, more immigration during this time period. And that trend will continue through the 1920s. But you're looking for true expansion of rights. the stuff we just talked about, we don't see so much of that, except women do gain the right to vote. So it's a fairly complicated discussion. Yeah, and World War I does start because Franz Ferdinand gets assassinated. So yeah, you can, if you want to start your essay, I'm sorry, your answer with why the entire war started, that is fine. And if you study World War I in great depth, which I don't imagine you have the chance to do in your world history class, nobody really liked Franz Ferdinand anyway. But I mean, Austria-Hungary wasn't, you know, they were upset with him because he married outside the royal family. And he had already been taken out of the line of succession to become king at any point. However, it did give them an excuse to attack Serbia, yeah. And yeah, so they wanted to create an empire in Central Europe, and they figured Bosnia, Serbia, some of the smaller countries were a good opportunity for them. Okay, all right. So, but the only thing I would say about question 5 is do a little bit of background, but not too much, because you got enough to talk about. And I don't want you to have to feel like you have to write 2 or 3 pages to answer that properly. I think you'd be okay with, you know, just a page or 2. Page really, if you're pretty concise. I did mention to a couple of you individually in your comments to think about organization before you start. So on this question, you know, definitely start with why the United States got involved. So, you know, you got to at least mention the Zimmerman note, and then make sure you put what year that happened. And then for that second part, I think I would have a little section where I talked about women, a little section where I talked about African Americans, a little section where I talked about Hispanic Americans. It doesn't have to be a separate paragraph, but it might be for each, and then have a conclusion where you say whatever it is you think. You know, if you conclude that this dramatically changes opportunities for these groups, you could say that. You could say, like, in a lot of ways it doesn't matter, but it does lead to larger populations in certain areas. It does give women the right to vote. So make some sort of conclusion that shows me, you know, that you've gotten the big picture, whatever you think the big picture might be. And just make sure the big picture is not incorrect. I wouldn't say that, you know, the lack of participation for women in politics leads to World War II. You know, don't say something that's inaccurate. So, you know, you can't just make any conclusion, but make sure you make a conclusion that makes sense. All right. Do you guys have any questions? I'm not meaning to be confusing or anything. All right. Double checking to see. Oh, when is class? Sorry, when I have to stop talking to you. Oh yeah, that's right. This is the class where I get the 3-minute warning. Thank goodness for that. All right. Let's go back to the, yeah, I know, 3-minute warning. It's so important. Okay, we do appreciate it. Now, yeah, we do need to talk about this stuff, I think, a little bit more than we did. So, lynching, we did talk about that. The book goes into a lot of depth about Birth of a Nation. So you can mention, you know, as you're wrapping up that question, if you want, you can talk about how the government was not, we do look forward to the 3-minute warning. It's true. You can mention that Wilson personally is not going to be supportive of African American rights, and you could, you know, and you would be correct, and you could have some examples. Immigration restrictions do continue. Oh, the NAACP becomes more active in part because they protest lynching very, very publicly, and they have a flag that they put outside of their headquarters that every time someone's lynched, the flag just says a man was lynched today. So their goal is to bring more public awareness to that and to make it a federal crime, to make lynching a federal crime, which they never succeed at, never succeed at. It's a law that typically passes the House, but not the Senate. And if you've watched political reporting lately, you understand that sometimes passing the House is easier than passing the Senate. Yeah, on lots of things. So, and again, I'm just saying that. I'm not saying anything beyond that. But the NAACP is going to become more politically active during this time period, and it's going to start to become more effective in large part because of W.E.B. Du Bois and because he's writing more publicly and speaking more publicly. And you've had that shift in population from the South to the North, because it's really easier to protest things in the North if you're African American. It still doesn't make you terribly popular, but it's safer in most instances. And you're going to get more press coverage. Immigration restrictions will continue by race and ethnicity. And what you'll see by the end of the 1920s, there's more discussion of this in the next chapter as well. But what you see by the 1920s is pretty much we're not letting anybody in. The only people we let in are Mexicans. And our concern is, we're still racist against Asians. We still have the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Gentleman's Agreement. So the two largest Asian groups, Chinese and Japanese, we're not letting those folks in. And Europeans, we don't want any Europeans at this point, because Europeans continue to start, they fight with each other and they start world wars, and it's where all the anarchists are. So we don't want any more Europeans. We just had 30 million new immigrants. A lot of them were from Central Europe. We don't want any more of them. So the only people we really trust are people from our hemisphere, and Canadians aren't coming down. So and we do still need, especially toward the end of World War I, more agricultural production and into the early 1920s. So Mexican immigration is going to be strongly encouraged. And one of the things you'll notice in the 20th century with Mexican immigration, and it continues through the 21st century, I think, although now is sort of an odd time. Well, now is an odd time for any immigration because of COVID. But until recently, if the economy is good, we are very encouraging of Mexican immigration. When the economy gets a little soft, that tends to be when we get in our build a wall mode, that sort of thing. Now in Texas especially, I think it's probably different in California. I haven't lived there, but just, from reading and stuff. I think Mexican immigration is a different thing in Texas because Texas is, I'll just say this, cheap. We don't give a whole lot of social programs. It's, it's a low tax state. So since it's a low tax state, there's not a whole lot of what you might consider social welfare programs. So, help for poor people. That doesn't come directly from the state government because we don't bring in as much tax money. So, because it's a low tax state by design. So people who emigrate to Texas don't immigrate to Texas because, they might have access to better health care that the state pays for, that sort of thing. They immigrate to Texas because they want a job. So people immigrate to Texas legally, illegally, primarily for work. So, and in this era, there weren't any social welfare programs really anywhere to speak of. So nobody went to any state to do anything other than work. All right, so by the end of the 20s, pretty much nobody's coming in except Mexicans. And racial violence from the North with the Great Migration increases. And you'll also see the enhancement of eugenics as a science. So you'll see lots of writing that in part, I guess it's a circle. It justifies the immigration policy, and the immigration policy probably enhances the beliefs in eugenics. And even when it's debunked as a science, it's created a prejudice that remains. And Marcus Garvey, there's the rise and fall of Marcus Garvey that's discussed in the textbook. I know that I just kind of mentioned in passing, that part of the reason he ends up going to jail, he is convicted for mail fraud and excuse me, some embezzlement. Mail fraud is an unusual charge, isn't it? It's a federal charge that can carry a larger sentence, and it's usually, it's like Al Capone getting put in jail for tax evasion. Sometimes mail fraud, tax evasion, those are charges that are used because the charges they attempted that are probably more accurate weren't as effective. And people who liked Marcus Garvey, thought that he was great. Even there are some guys like W.E.B. Du Bois who didn't like him because he really didn't push for education or advancement. He really pushed for Black separatism. Yeah. So the idea of rather than integrating into the community, building up the Black community and keeping it separate and making sure that it was strong. And what's interesting is when you see the civil rights movement after World War II, you'll see aspects of both the ideas of integration plus the idea of building up the Black community. All right, and as the war ends, I know we already talked about this, Wilson went overseas, everything was great, he was popular, not so much in the United States, we didn't join the League of Nations, we didn't ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson has a big stroke and then is ushered out of office. He does consider running for re-election because while his body is not healthy, apparently his ego still is, but he was not well physically after the second stroke, the major stroke. Most people who write about Wilson suggest that he had a minor stroke, possibly while he was in Europe, and then a major when he returned. And there's no doubt really about the major stroke. He wasn't able to walk or talk or write. So, but does eventually gain some recovery, however, not to the point where he gives a lot of public speeches or has a lot of public appearances, and then kind of fades out at the end of his second term. And he's replaced with Warren Harding, who wants the return to normalcy. All right, before we kind of breeze into chapter 20, is there anything you would like to talk about related to World War I, the weekly question, Woodrow Wilson, any of that stuff? I know some of it I probably went over twice, so I apologize if it was too much. All right, so if you have questions, shout them out or type them in the chat. All right, so the next chapter talks about the 1920s. Well, and as that first chapter ends, there's a discussion of the Red Scare, which kind of goes into this discussion. We are not super fond of communists during that time period. Now, it's not as bad as, say, after World War II, when we're really not fond of communists, but we're not excited about communists because Soviet Union, and they seem to be part of the labor unions in the United States. So when they passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, it does allow the US government to expel people from the country who say anti-government things, which it's primarily labor union leaders, it really is. And there's also a lot of anarchists, and there's socialists, communists, and anarchists, especially in Central and Eastern Europe during this time period. And two of the folks who gain notoriety in the United States are not terribly famous guys until they get convicted for murder. These guys, Sacco and Vanzetti. So Sacco and Vanzetti live in New York, and they are anarchists to a certain extent. They get arrested for killing the paymaster at their factory. Turns out that they didn't do it, most likely, but apparently not. Well, there's evidence to suggest that the police paid off informants to testify against them, that the likely murder weapon, which was found in a car they were using, wasn't theirs. The car they were using was probably from the people who did the actual murder. And there's stuff there are books you could read about this as well. But the reason that case, Sacco and Vanzetti, becomes fairly prominent is there will be lots of people who protest Sacco and Vanzetti's execution. They get convicted of murder, in large part because their political views are radical. Much more so Vanzetti than Sacco. Sacco, I think, was more of just a, day-to-day merchant kind of fellow who maybe wrong place, wrong time in a lot of ways. The book mentions a lot of fairly famous people who write about or who write in opposition of this execution. One of the ones they don't mention was a fellow named Felix Frankfurter. Like, that's a cool name. Yes, it is. He's eventually a Supreme Court justice, but he's one of the founders of the ACLU and a fairly noted lawyer during that time period. And he is going to write in a magazine called The Atlantic that he writes a list of reasons that Sacco and Vanzetti should not be executed. So this leads to a worldwide protest of the execution, especially in large cities in Europe. And the United States just kind of doubles down on it and says, yeah, we don't care. So they will be executed in 1927, and they'll be executed with international notoriety. So, but the United States doesn't care. Yeah. And it just, the book talks quite a bit about the people who are both for and against the execution. And they're probably, they definitely got the chair. Now, in that time period, that was a very common method of execution. Certainly in the modern era, we don't do that for lots of reasons, mostly because, cruel and unusual punishment. So, and people who are prominent writers during this time period will talk about how their execution and public support of their execution really shows that this anti-radical propaganda had been very successful. And yeah, it's really hard to argue against that. It would be hard to argue against that. All right. Stuff that matters in the 1920s, kind of in the book order, not necessarily chronological order. And then this will get us to why we have a Great Depression. All right. The car. Yeah, the car, not like my car, but just the car in general, although I guess my car is part of this. The automobile reshapes US culture. So we're not quite in the era where we have good roads or anything like that. What we have is Henry Ford. And Henry Ford wants to democratize the American automobile. There's some other things about Henry Ford that aren't as cool, but Henry Ford wants to democratize the American automobile, wants to make it well enough and cheaply enough that it's reliable and everyone can afford it, even the people who make it. It might not be true like if you worked at the Tesla factory, but Ford wants to make sure you can buy a Ford. So they create plants, an enormous one in Michigan, and then even a pretty big one in Brazil, where they also want to make tires. That one's closed, by the way. But they create a factory system. And I think a previous chapter talked about Fordism, the idea that you produce stuff that is affordable and cheap, and everybody expects to be able to own stuff. So it becomes fairly common for every family to have a car. This means you can travel farther to do stuff. Possibly you don't have to work right next to where you live. We're going to purchase stuff that's more portable. Now, this is not like 1950s drive-in culture, or we're going out to eat, or we're having vacations. We live in the middle of the country and we're going to the East Coast for vacation. It's not that kind of stuff, but it is day-to-day mobility. It also is going to change the economy a bit. So anything related to automobiles is going to become more prosperous, that part of the economy. Restaurants to a certain extent, but remember, it's still too early for things like McDonald's and Wendy's and Chick-fil-A and wherever you like to go and drive through and get food. But, more the sit-down restaurants. But it's not as uncommon for people to go out to eat. And anything that's used to produce a car, that's going to become more valuable, and production of that will be more valuable. Also, most people aren't paying cash for their car, so the idea of buying on credit, getting loans, that sort of stuff is going to increase. And you'll see this in a big way in the 20s. We're going to buy a whole bunch of stuff we don't really need and can't actually afford. That's been an American thing for a long time, but this will help increase that. Also, the kids probably won't get their own car like is common in modern culture. Some of you go like, not in my house, it's not common. But in some cultures, yeah, okay, ashtrays, that's true. Trendy, smoking was really trendy up through probably about the 1960s and 70s. So that's true. And in this era, they thought it was probably healthy for you. That, by the World War II right after, they know it isn't, but, and certainly it's popular in movies and things like that. Okay, so teens wouldn't get their own car, but they might get to use it on the weekend. And it creates kind of a separate teen culture, the idea that they would go to dances or movies or parties or something like that. I don't know. So a little bit of independence and mobility, separate teen culture. Plus, kids are waiting longer to get married. Maybe they work a few years before they get married. Occasionally, people go to college. It's not the biggest thing, but people do it a little. But any industry related to automobiles is going to do well. And also the assumption too, because the stock market's increasing, the assumption is the stock market would never ever go lower. It will always keep increasing. And we know that's not exactly how it turns out. Anything not related to the car is probably not doing well. Food and textile, anything related to agriculture is not doing well, because toward the end of the teens, everything we were producing, we were selling to all of our allies in the war. Once Europe recovers from World War I, they're starting to grow their own food again and resume their sources of textiles, that sort of stuff. So we're not selling as much to Europe in World War I. Also, because the petroleum industry is booming during this time period, they're figuring out other stuff to do with petroleum, like creating those stretchy clothes. So artificial fabrics start to be produced during this time period as well. Labor unions are going to lose some political support as well during this time period. So if you work in a factory job, there's probably not as much protection for you. However, because the economy is booming, at least early to mid 20s, and because machinery is better, you're probably working shorter hours and making the same amount of money, or perhaps a little bit more. 20s is very pro-business. Your presidents in the 20s see government and business as partners, so they work together. And not Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover is the Secretary of Commerce through most of the decade. He's Secretary of Commerce for Harding and, the quiet guy, Calvin Coolidge, for Harding and Coolidge, silent Cal, C-A-L. And then, of course, as president toward the end of the decade. And Calvin Coolidge will say stuff like, the business of America is business, and what's good for General Motors is good for America, that sort of thing. So there's really not any progressive reform in this era. The idea is that governments should work in partnership with business to create bigger markets, more profit, that sort of thing, because that would be better for everyone if business makes more money. So no government intervention and no progressive era reforms, any of that kind of stuff. It's just work with business, give business what they want. Workers' rights are declining during this era. Unions will lose power to negotiate for wages. Yellow dog contracts are pretty prominent. Those are agreements that you make, like if you take this job, you promise not to join a union. So that becomes more prominent during this time period, and worker behavior codes, which include you not joining a union, are pretty prominent in this era. Ford certainly has those. And Ford resists unionization up until right before World War II. Yeah, they resisted a long time. And Ford thinks that because he pays his workers well, that they really shouldn't want or need a union. And he'll continue to think that even when his workers don't agree with it. They probably agree during this time period. And there's still no minimum wage yet either. They also proposed the Equal Rights Amendment during this time period, but it's proposed and rejected. And it essentially says that there will be no discrimination based on sex or on the basis of sex. And we'll propose that in the 20s after World War I, in the 50s after World War II, and then again when I'm a kid, not because I'm a kid, but that's just when it happened, in the 70s after the Vietnam War. And it's 0 for 3. All right. But you didn't get that, but you get flappers. You get some unusual cultural stuff for that generation of women, kind of post high school, but pre-marriage. So they're going to go out and drink and smoke and wear short skirts, not like super short skirts, but to your knees, that sort of stuff. So it's easier to dance. They get the bobbed haircut, so they cut it at their ears all at kind of the same length. And they may talk about sex. They may actually participate in sex before marriage, that sort of stuff. Statistics suggest that that's not the most common thing, but that it probably does double, but that may be something like from 10 to 20% of people. But culture becomes a little looser during this time period. Movies and depiction of culture becomes a lot looser. Most women are going to remain fairly conservative. Once you're married, you kind of settle in again and you're not flapping too much. But flappers are really the representation of women in popular culture, and certainly that upper middle class or middle class urban woman who's between being a kid and married. So you see some of that. And also this is women drinking in and young men as well, drinking in public during prohibition, which made alcohol illegal, which clearly didn't exactly make alcohol illegal. It creates a whole kind of underground culture of speakeasies, secret clubs, that sort of thing. And again, that's much more of an urban thing. And we'll have I think there's a little section coming up where we just talk about prohibition. So we'll hang on to that for a sec. Business of America's business, reform is out, Republicans are in. Your presidents in the 20s are Republicans. So you've got Harding and then Coolidge and then Hoover. And the thought is that the prosperity of the 20s is related to Republican leadership. So also the stock market crash of the 20s is going to be attributed to Republican leadership. So you get a whole decade of Democrats after this. So decade of Republicans followed by a decade of Democrats. Okay. So the Wall Street Journal declares, never before has a government been so completely fused with business. And that is true. The Harding administration will be synonymous with corruption, especially loaning. These scandals are loaning out federal lands for harvesting of oil, and that the loaning of the federal lands is kind of under the table, and kickbacks or bribes are being paid to people within the Harding administration, possibly even Harding himself. When that's discovered, some people go to jail, Harding dies, and Harding either dies of a heart attack, a stroke, or maybe his wife poisoned him, but probably not. It's probably heart attack or stroke. I think I'm not smiling because I think you should poison your spouse. You should not. But his wife, not super fond of him at times because we'll say he was friendly. I know that I used to use a textbook where it talked a lot about Harding, and they had a quote from his father that said something like, "Son, if you'd been a woman, you'd be in the family way that would be pregnant all the time." So apparently he was quite friendly and continued that friendliness through his marriage. He also hosted alcohol parties at the White House during Prohibition. So he was definitely one of those rules don't apply to me guys. When the scandals come out is when he dies, and probably the stress of the scandal or just being an older guy caused the stroke or heart attack. He's replaced by his vice president, who's a pretty straight-laced guy. Calvin Coolidge ended some police strikes when he was a politician in Massachusetts. And he definitely restores personal integrity to the office of the presidency, but his economic policies are very, very similar. Foreign policy focuses on trade and economics. We definitely do not want to get involved in other people's nationalistic or political struggles because we don't want to be involved in another international conflict. We see the Great War, because we've only had one at that point. We see involvement in the Great War as a mistake that cost the United States dearly and didn't gain us any benefit. So we want to avoid stuff like that in the future. Colonialism ensures, so the idea of taking colonies ensures that the United States and Great Britain have a lot of access to oil in the Middle East and Latin America, and that'll continue to be a big part of foreign policy, maybe not the major, sort of depends on your opinion on this, but a big part of foreign policy for decades to come. And there's a fellow named Schenck that gets charged under the Alien and Sedition Acts because he is encouraging people to resist their draft notices. He is going to argue that he has a First Amendment freedom of speech. His case, the Schenck case, goes all the way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court decides in a very famous ruling that you essentially your freedom of speech ends where your neighbor's nose begins. So if your freedom of speech causes harm to other people, it's no longer your freedom of speech. It's a clear and present, if it causes a clear and present danger to someone else or to the country, then it's not protected. And the example they give in the ruling is shouting fire in a crowded theater. That sort of speech that causes harm is not protected. All right, during this time period, dang, the culture is struggling a bit for sure. Oh goodness, sorry, I was just peeking at this. There's not a whole lot in here about the causes of the Great Depression, like directly. So, I would say to you, causes of Great Depression, kind of indirect, and they've really, I think it probably shows up kind of right at the end of this. Let me peek in the book, because I know that I've told you might be able to get started on this, even though it's not really due till next week, so I don't want to distress you or anything. There's a section, starts on page 810, about the Great Depression. Make sure that that actually is, yep, that is still in this chapter. Excuse me for the yawn. So maybe we pause for just a minute to talk about that, and then we'll go back to the cultural stuff. So in your textbook, page 810, if you're starting to think about the Great Depression, the changes in the economy that we'd already talked about, where there's an emphasis on government cooperation with manufacturing, especially manufacturing related to automobiles, and almost every other sector of the economy is soft. Also, there are very few rules about trading stocks during this time period. Because the government wants to partner with business, they really aren't limiting business in very many ways. So you see the ability during this time period to borrow money to buy stocks, which is going to be a problem during this time period. And even stock brokers would be able to give loans to their customers to help buy those stocks. Also, companies really assume that the economy will always continue to grow, so they continue to produce, and not manage their inventories. So at the time, even a little bit before the stock market crash, inventories on consumer goods are really large, but sales of consumer goods are not. So that's not being monitored very carefully. And of course, there's some international issues as well. There's, I'm sorry, I kind of skipped over the real estate speculation as well. So people are able to buy houses or buy land and resell it and make a lot of money and charge a lot of interest. Now, the people who borrowed money to buy real estate, to buy stocks, all of this sort of stuff, were not able to pay back that money once the stock market crashed and the economy starts to officially collapse. So when they can't repay their loans, then banks collapse. And then people who even, most people didn't take a loan on real estate, and most people didn't buy stocks during that time period. But even those people who just deposited their money in their banks would lose their money because banks were not insured. There's also an international economic problem because the entire world is suffering through this economic collapse at the same time. And that's related in part to debt from World War I. And we didn't talk about the Treaty of Versailles, but you may remember, it's definitely in the book, and you may remember it from your world history class. But the Treaty of Versailles assessed war guilt or reparations. Yeah, no problem on the internet thing. To Germany. So Germany was assessed as like $33 billion in reparations, and that was more money than they could ever afford to pay. So as they were defaulting on their loans, and they were supposed to make some other payments directly to England and France, if they defaulted on their loans, then England and France couldn't pay money that they owed from assistance during World War I to the United States. So in the Dawes Reorganization Plan, which is different than the Dawes Act, this restructures German debt from World War I. So US banks end up financing German debt from World War I. So when Germany, so that way Germany can repay England and France, and then England and France can repay the United States. And as long as Germany continues to pay on their loans, everybody's good. Well, the German economy completely collapses, and they have to even cancel their currency and start over. So the Germans default on their payments to the United States and can't make theirs to France and England. So the entire international economic system collapses as well. If you're wondering, did Germany ever repay that? Yeah, they've made their last payment on the reparations to the restructured debt to the United States probably about 10 years ago. It's weird stuff, isn't it? So the economy is pretty stinky for a variety of reasons. And the lack of regulation of stock trades, the lack of insurance on bank accounts, those things probably did not help. That will be the understatement of the day. Now, if you're wanting to work on that next question about the Great Depression, if you start toward the end of the chapter, I think I know, I just said, and then I turned to the page, page 810. And the beautiful thing about your textbook, if you guys haven't enjoyed your textbook yet, is the subject headings are pretty helpful. All right, so religion in the 1920s, we like it. We're going to church a lot in the 20s, and especially in the middle of the country. This is still, truer in the middle of the country, I think, than on the coast, but I'm not saying people on the coast are heathens and don't go to church. I am saying that you probably see more churches in the middle of the country. Fundamentalism is pretty trendy during this time period, and this is the type of Christianity where they really like the Bible, and they probably, read it out loud in the sermons, and you study it. So fundamentalist Christianity is pretty focused on the Bible. Okay, I'm muting someone because I think they're chewing. I could be wrong about the noise. So, excuse me, the Scopes monkey trial is pretty famous during this time period. And if you read about this, if you find a book about this, you might enjoy it. Depends on what kind of stuff you like to read about as far as history goes. But there's a fellow named John Scopes who's convinced by one of his college friends to teach evolution because it's illegal in the state of Tennessee. The Butler Law was passed that you couldn't teach evolution. Now, that law was passed so that people in Tennessee would vote for this Butler fellow because he was more spiritual than other people. It's like Butler, he doesn't want evolution taught, or evolution, if you like that better. He doesn't want that taught because it will corrupt the kids. So we got to vote for him because he stands for God, and we want that guy to be reelected. So Butler sponsors a law that's passed that really is never intended to be enforced. The ACLU tries to talk somebody into teaching evolution so they can overturn the law. Scopes is the fellow who gets talked into it. He is subbing for a biology teacher who's out for 2 or 3 months. He has no idea what evolution is, but his friend George Rapalea says, hey, just read him this Darwin's Origin of the Species thing, and then we'll get you arrested and we'll get you a really good lawyer. So Scopes says, okay, whatever. So he does it, and then his college buddy, ACLU member buddy, says, did you teach evolution? And he goes, probably, not sure. And he goes, yeah, if you read the book, you taught evolution. So he gets arrested, and it takes quite a while to get him arrested because the police don't want to arrest him for that. The school board's really not that upset. But anyway, he gets arrested, and they have this trial. The people who are prosecuting this trial hire a really famous attorney, and it's William Jennings Bryan, yeah, the guy who ran for president as a populist and a Democrat. And so then for the defense, they have to get somebody famous as well. So they end up getting Clarence Darrow, who's the most famous defense attorney of the time period. And then it ends up being a really public discussion about science versus the Bible, that sort of thing. And in the middle of the country, science versus the Bible's going to win. And one of the lawyers, Darrow, ends up questioning William Jennings Bryan as an expert on the Bible. Scopes, who's not really married to this idea of teaching evolution, becomes a little more supportive of it as time goes along. The trial is kind of a carnival atmosphere. They have little kids' rides and petting zoos and signs on the courthouse that say read your Bible daily, and it's covered by a fairly famous news reporter. What was that guy's name? Crud, I hate it when I do this and I can't remember. I'll think of it later. But it gets covered in a way, it's pretty prominent. Billy Sunday is going to preach about it. I don't know, it's a weird time period, perhaps. When the trial is over, H.L. Mencken, that's the name of the guy who reports it. I'm pretty sure. Am I right about that? I think I'm right. But when the, maybe, I don't know. I'll look that up. When the trial is over, Scopes is convicted of teaching evolution because he did. And then the trial judge fines him $100. And he says he'll appeal that all the way to the Supreme Court because the ACLU wants the law overturned. What ends up happening is they win their first appeal, so they don't go to the Supreme Court. And the state says, we are not going through that mess again. The people who were in favor, I know it's 3-minute warning. I'm going to look though, just to make sure. Good job, thank you. The people who are in favor of evolution say that this is the death of fundamentalism. It certainly is not. The people who were in favor of fundamentalism and the Butler Law said that this really upheld the standards of, good, solid Americans during this time period. And this is probably a good place to stop. The general idea in the 20s is we become really strongly anti-immigrant. The KKK becomes more prominent during this time period, but you also start to see the expansion of the NAACP a bit. The KKK will kind of collapse at the end of the 20s because it turns out their leader was not a nice person. What a shock. And we'll talk about this in more detail. And the Harlem Renaissance is prominent during this era, which would really be a fun thing for you to read about too, if you want to find a book about that. So I'm going to go ahead and close out the discussion for today and see if you guys have any questions that you would like to ask. I'll go back and kind of alter the due dates on the assignments page, and then I'll try to send you something that shows the change in due dates. But to be 100% honest with you, I don't see myself having time to do that until probably Saturday night or Sunday at the earliest. All right, before we go, I guess I could stop